Today's Torah study was sponsored in memory of David Schwartz, Zichrono Livracha, a very good friend of mine who was killed 10 days ago in Gaza fighting for Am Yisrael. And David was somebody who I felt extremely close to. Very, very great tragedy. But David is one of hundreds of people who have been killed on the Israeli side in this war. And each person who dies is a tremendous loss, not just for this person, but also just the devastating impacts upon their family. David was married to Meital Gitler, also somebody I feel extremely close to. And for their wedding, they got married in COVID. The family produced this book of David's Divrei Torah on the weekly Torah portion. And there was a Dvar Torah on one on every portion. But that didn't stop. David continued to write Divrei Torah even after this book was published. And he sent me from time to time Divrei Torah. So what I'd like to start today with is studying the Dvar Torah that David wrote for Parashat Bo. I did a 1 minute, not summary, but I distilled 1 minute from this Dvar Torah and I put it up on our YouTube channel. But this will be a longer discussion because it's a 2-page Dvar Torah in Hebrew, which is really equivalent to 4 pages in English. Actually, there's also a WhatsApp group where every week they're putting out the Dvar Torah in Hebrew and in English. And those who want to join that WhatsApp group to get the Dvar Torah every week, you can ask me for information on how to join that WhatsApp group. And the English ones, at least the first 2 weeks, were translated by my brother Akiva Hertzfeld. So it's an excellent translation. Let me read what David says about Parashat Bo. And of course, if you have questions, don't hesitate to stop and don't hesitate to ask your question. Raise your hand and ask. So, writes David. Parashat Bo is going to conclude the exile from Egypt and takes into and actualizes the signs and the wonders, the final signs and the wonders of God. So the passage of Bo is the portion which is the last time we're going to be in exile in Egypt. And we have the final signs and miracles that God did to lead us out. From the first 9 plagues, from every one of these plagues, Moses and Aaron turned to Pharaoh with a request to send forth the Jewish people from his land. Paro's complete stubbornness, time after time, brings on the next plague. Simple understanding of the verses of the Torah, from a simple understanding, we can see that there's a huge difference, a distinction between the plague of the firstborn, which is the final plague, and the other plagues. With respect to Hashem's involvement in the plagues. So right away we see that the 10th plague is fundamentally different from the other 9 plagues vis-a-vis God's involvement. Because the verse states in chapter 12, verse 12, that God says, and I will pass over in the entire land of Egypt on this night, Vavarti be'eretz Mitzrayim b'layla hazeh, V'keti kol bechor me'eretz Mitzrayim, and I will strike the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from man until the animal, me'adam v'abema, ubekol el hey Mitzrayim, from all the gods of Egypt, Eseh Shvatim. I will bring them to judgment. Ani Hashem. I am God. Continues David. B'kol Shana, every year, around the Seder table, we say, V'avarti be'eretz Mitzrayim b'layla hazeh, I will cross over into Egypt on this night. Ani v'lo malach, I will do it and not an angel. V'kesi kol b'chor be'eretz Mitzrayim, and I will strike every firstborn from the land of Egypt. Ani v'lo seraph, I and not a serpent. Kol Elohei Mitzrayim Eseh Shvatim, Ani v'lo hashliach, I and not an agent. Ani Hashem, Ani hu lo acher. God always says at the Seder, it's always, we say it's going to be God, 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 and not anyone else. And so writes David, the question that arises from this, why is God's personal involvement in the plague, why is that only by the 10th plague? Why isn't God personally involved in the previous 9 plagues? Why is it only in the 10th plague that God is personally involved? Furthermore, in addition to this distinction, we see another distinction that's going on now as opposed to the previous 9 plagues. And what is that? In the other 9 plagues, there was no involvement or effort from Bnei Israel. The Bnei Israel didn't need to do anything in the previous 9 plagues. But in the 10th plague, they all of a sudden had to do something. It's only by the 10th plague was there a need for a personal action that would cause a separation between God, between Israel and the Egyptians. Hashem himself made his own independent distinction earlier Hashem himself had made his own independent distinction without any involvement of the Jewish people, as it says that Hashem will distinguish between the cattle of the Israelites and between the cattle of the Egyptians. Whereas, in contrast to this, when it comes to the plague of the firstborn, Moshe is commanded to tell the Bnei Israel to sign, to make a mark on their lintels, and also the 2 doorposts with blood, so that when the plague is done at night, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can draw a distinction between the houses of the Jews and the houses of the Egyptians. What was the need for this? So just to summarize what David is saying in his opening paragraph, is that we see in the 10th plague 2 fundamental distinctions. In the last of the plagues, we see 2 fundamental distinctions. First is, all of a sudden, God is personally involved. I am not an angel. I am not an emissary. I am not an agent. Why all of a sudden, only in the 10th plague, is God involved? And number 2, there was a need in this 10th plague for the Jewish people to do something, or the Bnei Israel to do something to cause a distinction between them and the Egyptians. Whereas in the other plague, we saw that God himself could draw this distinction between the Jewish cattle and the Egyptian cattle. Why all of a sudden was there a need for the Bnei Israel to make this distinction in the 10th plague? This is the question that David puts out there. Everybody following this? Okay. So David, and he likes to do this in a lot of his Divrei Torah, cites the Slonim Rebbe, the Netivot Shalom. He says the Netivot Shalom explains that there are two aspects to the 10 plagues. The reason why God brings these plagues, there's two aspects. One aspect of the plagues is to take the Jewish people out from the exile of Egypt in a physical manner. One aspect of the plagues is to physically cause the Jewish people to be redeemed. And a second aspect is that Hashem is choosing the Jewish people to be for him a treasure nation. Again, two aspects to these plagues. The first is to physically lead the Jewish people to freedom. The second aspect is Hashem's selection of the Jewish people as his treasured nation. The plague of the firstborn was done, in order to accomplish both of these parts, both of these goals. On a simple level, we could say that the plague was given, like all the other plagues, to bring the Jewish people to freedom. We could say that on a simple level, that's the purpose of the plague. But on a deeper level, the 10th plague comes not to free the Jewish people, but to show the Jewish people that they are the chosen people, being chosen by God to be the treasure nation. With this plague, David writes, "B'makazu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu bocher b'Yisrael ka'am Hashem." With this plague, Hashem is choosing the Bnei Israel like a people of Hashem. Hashem is taking the Jewish people out from the 49 gates of Tumah, and he's bringing into reality, into existence, his promise that he made to the patriarchs, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, "You shall know that that your seed will be foreigners in a land that does not belong to them, and they will afflict them and oppress them for 400 years, and also this nation that they will serve, I will judge, and afterwards they will go out with great wealth." That's the verse from Genesis 15, verse 13 and 14. From the depth of the matter, we could say that in order to fulfill this covenant and these lofty goals, it wasn't sufficient for Hashem to send an agent like he did with the other plagues, but Hashem had to do it personally in order to fulfill his promise. Hashem had made a promise and he had to fulfill it. And that's why, since Hashem, and this is what the Slonim and what David is saying, that's why, since this was a fulfillment of this promise, it wasn't enough to have someone else do it. Hashem had made a promise. Hashem needed to do it himself. But still, we don't understand. Why was there a need to mark their houses specifically by this plague? And especially if this plague was being carried out by God himself, why does the plague require us to mark our homes, our ancestors to mark their homes? Of course, God can distinguish between the homes of the Jewish people and the homes of the Egyptians. So says the Slonim that the marking of the homes with the blood was not done for the purpose of the plague, because in fact, every plague was done without any sign, without this sign or without any sign. So what's the purpose of the sign? The purpose of the sign was necessary for Hashem to choose the people as the nation of God. There was a need to check who is Jewish, who is worthy to be connected to this nation. But this whole purpose of the sign was only from the concept of the selection of the Jewish people, and it was not really connected to the plague itself. Meaning to say, vis-a-vis the plague, there was no need for Hashem really to have the Jewish people mark their homes, because Hashem had already shown back in chapter 9 that the plagues could distinguish between the Jews and the non-Jews. But there was a need to see who was worthy to be connected to the Jewish people. The sign was not for God. The sign was for the Jews. That's what the Slonim are saying. Writes David, Yehudi sherotzeh liot mishuyach la'am Yisrael tzarich lahasot hishtadlut mitzido. V'kamuvan she'en HaKadosh Baruch Hu tzarich et oto simun. A Jew who wants to be connected to Am Yisrael needs to do his own efforts. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu does not need this sign. The sign was for the Jewish people themselves. At this moment, when the Jewish people were leaving Egypt, there was a need with a strong intent from the side of Bnei Israel to be complete partners in the redemption. The Bnei Israel needed to be the partners of God in the redemption. A Jew who wants to be a part of this redemption needed to do an action that testified to his will. The mitzvah of circumcision and the mitzvah of Pesach symbolize in a very strong form the connection and the covenant between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Am Yisrael. So the circumcision, which they did on the night of the Exodus, and the blood, they show not that Hashem is picking the Jewish people, but that the Jewish people are ready to take an action with their blood to be part of Bnei Israel. And writes the Slonimer, these two main concepts are the foundation of the Jewish people that the Judaism rests upon. A person who's not circumcised or refuses to bring the Paschal lamb has the severe penalty of karet. And Chazal say, Rashi quotes this, that in the merit of the blood of the Paschal lamb and the blood of the circumcision, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. The people who were ready to give of their blood, they gave of their blood. That's how they were redeemed from Egypt. Through these two mitzvot, the Jewish people were chosen to be a nation of Hashem. At this great moment of challenge, there was a need to know who is Jewish, within whom burns the desire to be a part of the chosen people. That was the Slonimer. David ends off his paragraph. The great lesson that we can learn from here is the understanding that in order to be a complete, full partner, a real partner amongst the nation of God, it's not enough to sit and fulfill the commandments like a slave that does the commandment of his master. But rather, what's required is to dig and to do our own efforts so that we could fulfill our task in this world to be active and creative souls, and not to live in this world like a driven leaf. To dwell in this world from the understanding that what it means to be a Jew who fulfills the Torah and the mitzvot means to be actively involved in trying to serve Hashem, in figuring out the ways to serve Hashem. And that is what leads us to become Mamlech HaKohanim V'Goy Kadosh. Just to want to summarize what David said, and I see that there are questions. Let me just summarize David's Dvar Torah one more time. And it's a beautiful thought that he's sharing. And his basic point is that we come in this portion as we leave Egypt to the last plague, the plague of the firstborn. And when we're leaving Egypt and we have the plague of the firstborn, we notice two fundamental differences between this plague and all the previous plagues. First of all, in this plague alone, it's the emphasis on God's personal involvement, as opposed to the other plagues. And number two, in this plague alone, we see the concept of the Bnei Yisrael having to make a sign to distinguish themselves, unlike the other plagues. And explains David that the reason why we needed Hashem's personal involvement in this plague was to indicate that Hashem himself, to reinforce the message that Hashem himself is choosing us to be the nation in fulfillment of the oath or the covenant that Hashem had promised the patriarchs. But the reason why we need to make a sign is to demonstrate that in order for us to be freed, it is not sufficient. In order for the Jewish people themselves to be freed, it would not be sufficient just for God to redeem us, but our ancestors needed to do commandments to show that we are choosing God, that we are active participants in the redemption story. Otherwise, it's not sufficient. And that the spiritual path requires us to always dig deeper and to look for ways that we could dig in order to become active partners of God. And that is what makes us the true people of a holy nation following the path of Hashem. This is the beautiful Dvar Torah that David wrote for Parshas Bo. So I see a few questions, so let me stop.